The snow lay thick over Dust Hollow, burying the crooked wooden houses that hunched against the winter wind, screaming through every crack. Inside, Widow Eliza kept a lamp burning low, its meager glow just enough to hold back the cold creeping into her bones. Her hands trembled as she gathered the last crumbs of bread, trying to stretch a meal for her children. Then came a pounding at the door, sharp and urgent. On the threshold stood a stranger, a lone cowboy with a weather-beaten face, carrying bread, milk, and a kindness no one had asked for. Yet he was the very man the town still whispered about, the one they blamed for her husband's death years ago. The fire in the hearth threw their shadows high upon the wall, two fates bound together though they stood worlds apart. A truth waited, ready to break free, and when it did, would Eliza open her heart or bar the door forever? That winter night on the Wyoming plains was so cold that the slightest crack of a window let the wind sweep in, damp and merciless, cutting straight through the worn wood. Eliza's cabin sat hunched on the hillside, battered by years of storms. Its walls gaped with narrow seams, the roof sagged and leaked. Inside, the fire in the hearth flickered faintly, writhing like it might surrender at any moment to the thick, swallowing dark. Eliza sat curled in a rickety wooden chair, clutching a frayed blanket close. Her gaze drifted now and then to the bed in the corner, where Jacob and Lydia, her two little ones, lay bundled together like a pair of hungry kittens, holding fast to each other in their sleep. Their cheeks were hollow, their lips moved faintly, as if still chasing warmth inside their dreams. A sharp ache pulled at Eliza's heart. All they'd eaten that day was a thin porridge scraped from the last of the cornmeal. She had given up her portion, feigning fullness so they might rest easy. But the gnawing in her stomach had a way of betraying her lie. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone nearly a year now. A foolish accident on the range, a slip into a ravine while driving cattle. His death came swift, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a failing ranch for Eliza to shoulder alone. At first, the neighbors lent what help they could, but their own burdens were heavy. And so, slowly, the cabin had become a lonely island adrift in a sea of snow. Eliza had grown used to enduring. But since Thomas's passing, each winter night had stretched longer, heavier. More than once she had sat at the window, staring out into the dark, listening to the wind's hollow cry as though it were some wild creature circling her walls, and she would wonder how much longer she could hold out. Death no longer frightened her, but those children, her children, they still needed shelter, a spark of warmth, no matter how faint. Tonight was no different. She was just about to lay another log on the fire when she heard a sound outside the porch. At first, she thought it the wind catching the eaves. Then came a knock, soft, deliberate, unhurried, as though whoever stood there knew she was listening. Her chest tightened. She set the wood down carefully and moved toward the door, every step measured. Out here, a widow was an easy mark. Wanderers sniffing after whiskey, sometimes thieves. Her fingers gripped the bar across the door, her ears straining. No boots creaked on the porch boards, no horse stamped in the yard, only the wind breathing through the stillness. She hesitated. Then, guided by some instinct, she slid back the bar and cracked the door. Moonlight washed the porch silver. Resting there on the step lay a loaf of bread wrapped in coarse cloth, and beside it, a glass bottle glinting pale. A bottle of milk. Eliza froze. Her mind leapt at once to suspicion. A cruel trick? A trap? But the bread was warm still, the faint sweetness drifting up to her nose, softening her doubt. She lifted her eyes. That was when she saw him, a man standing just beyond the porch, cloaked in shadow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, blocking out a piece of the moon behind him. A dust-stained coat draped his frame, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Yet the light was enough to catch the cut of his jaw, the straight bridge of his nose, and eyes so deep she could not tell if they carried sorrow or warmth. He said nothing, only tipped his head in a single, firm nod, a wordless greeting. Before she could summon breath to speak, he turned. His stride was long, steady, crunching through the snow until the sound faded into the wind. Soon only his outline remained against the dark expanse of the plains. Then even that was gone. Eliza stood rooted at the doorway, her hand trembling as it brushed the loaf. It was fresh, heat still clinging to it as though pulled from an oven not long ago. The milk, too, held its warmth, proof it had been drawn at dawn. Who would trouble themselves to bring such things here, in a land where most barely had enough to keep their own? What was a poor widow to anyone? She carried the gifts inside, setting them upon the table. A strange feeling coursed through her, a stirring long absent. The scent of bread rising in the night pulled her back to days when Thomas would return from town with loaves tucked under his arm, sometimes a sweet tucked away for the children. Memory pressed her eyes hot with tears, but unease returned as swiftly as it had lifted. Who was this man? Why choose this bitter night to come knocking, to leave food without asking anything in return? Was he benefactor, or something far more complicated? Through the window, the yard lay silent beneath the moon, the stranger's boot prints etched deep in the snow, a trail of proof that he had stood there, if only for a breath of time. His absence filled the air with something she could not name, a mingling of comfort and unease. Inside the little cabin, her children slept on, blissfully unaware that a stranger's hand had left them sustenance. Eliza, meanwhile, felt something kindle inside her chest, a flame not lit by the hearth, but by the quiet, mysterious presence of a man who had stepped from the dark, bearing bread, milk, and a silence that lingered like a promise in the bitter night. The next morning, pale winter sunlight slipped through the thin curtain of Eliza's cabin. She woke in the lingering chill, listening to the prairie wind drag along the hills, carrying with it the faint smell of neighbors' wood smoke. She pulled the blanket snug around Jacob and Lydia, then went to stir the fire back to life. On the table lay the half loaf of bread and the nearly empty milk bottle, proof of the stranger's visit the night before. Breakfast was fuller than usual, yet the questions in her mind gnawed just the same. Who was he? And why had he known of her children's hunger? By mid-morning, Eliza wrapped herself in a shawl, lifted Lydia to her hip, and took Jacob by the hand to walk into town for salt and a scrap of cloth to mend his coat. The road was muddy with ruts carved deep from wagons after the storm. The church bell tolled, reminding everyone that even in bitter winter, life went on. Dust Hollow was the kind of place where every face was known and every rumor carried like smoke on the wind. The moment Eliza stepped into Mrs. Whitcomb's store, she felt it. An odd shift in the air. A small knot of women lingered near the sugar barrel, speaking low. When their eyes found her, they offered stiff smiles before bowing their heads again, voices sinking into whispers. Eliza had long grown accustomed to such glances since Thomas's death, pity laced with scrutiny, but today something sharper cut through the murmurs. "He's back in town," one woman said. "Hasn't changed a bit. Still carries that shadow with him." another replied. And then a name floated clear enough to pierce Eliza's chest. McAllister. Her breath caught. Was that the same tall cowboy who had left bread and milk on her porch? The eldest of the women clicked her tongue. They say he was tangled in that land dispute out by the valley. The Pritchards lost everything. Folks whisper the papers weren't clean, that the land was signed over in ways that don't sit right. Some believe he walked away with more than his share. The words struck Eliza like cold water. The man she had silently thanked as her children ate. Was he bound up in such shadows? On the walk home, she hardly noticed the snowfall or the sound of horses clopping past. Each step dragged heavy through the mud. Jacob and Lydia chattered about their morning milk, their little faces lit with simple joy. But when Jacob asked, "Mama, will the man come back?" she found no answer. Her heart wavered between gratitude and suspicion. Last night, he had brought warmth to her children. This morning, the town reminded her that kindness often carried a price. That evening, Eliza sat by the oil lamp, needle in hand, eyes fixed on the tear in Jacob's coat. The wind moaned over the eaves. Wolves cried from far ridges. In her mind, she saw again the cowboy's silent nod, the shadow of him against the snow. His eyes had not seemed cruel, and yet the whispers pulled her into doubt. Was he drawing near with some hidden purpose? Did her small cabin stand on ground that others still contested? Or was he merely a drifter, a man with a past that clung to him like burrs no matter where he went? Sleep came hard. Jacob tossed. Lydia wheezed softly with a cold. But Eliza lay wide-eyed, telling herself she would not be swayed by a loaf of bread. Then came the faintest sound outside, the muffled halt of hooves. Her heart clenched. She pulled back the curtain, only to see the yard bathed in moonlight, empty as the plains beyond. By dawn, the stories spread louder still. At the saloon, men argued whether McAllister had once drawn a gun in a quarrel, slipping free of the law for lack of evidence. Some swore he was guilty. Others claimed he was a scapegoat. The truth blurred, tangled in a dozen retellings, and Eliza began to see. The man who left bread and milk had also left behind a scar that reached further than she knew. Now she stood at a crossroads. Open her heart, or wall it higher still. In the dim light of winter morning, she felt her spirit like the cabin around her, sturdy enough to stand against storms, yet riddled with cracks where the wind slipped through, leaving her vulnerable to every stir of doubt. Eliza would not admit it, not even to herself. But each evening, her ears strained toward the road the moment dusk fell. When the children settled into uneasy sleep, she found herself listening, waiting for that one sound that broke the silence of the prairie night. And sure enough, as steady as the turning of the earth, the rhythm of hooves drew near, pausing on frozen ground. A man's steps followed, solid on the porch. Then came the faintest clink of glass, the weight of something set down with care. After that, only the wind breathed through the seams of the cabin. She always waited before opening the door. Fear held her back. The fear of meeting those eyes again, eyes she did not yet know how to face. But whenever she did gather the courage to look, there it was, a loaf still warm, a bottle of milk cool with the night air. No note, no mark, only the certainty of his presence as constant as the rising sun. At first, she had received these offerings as a mercy, a gift dropped into her hunger without reason. But as nights gathered into weeks, the mercy shifted into something else, a pull she could not shake, a tightening of her chest each time she heard the horse draw near. More than once, she scolded herself in silence. I never asked for him to come. Yet when his steps sounded on the porch, her hands trembled as though touching a thread stretched invisible between them. The children, sharp-eyed as all children are, sensed it before she confessed it even to herself. One evening Jacob whispered, his eyes alight, "Mama, he'll come again tonight. I just know it." Eliza snapped, telling him not to speak foolishness. But later that night, when the knock of hooves reached her ears, her own heart echoed the boy's certainty. Gratitude and dread warred inside her. His gifts meant her children endured another night, another dawn. Yet the town's whispers haunted her. They said he had a hand in land disputes, that families had lost their homes while he walked away with the gain. Her fingers shook each time she broke bread, as though she were lifting a shadow she did not understand. One night she resolved to end it. She stood at the door, hand on the latch, waiting for his steps. When they came, she meant to fling the door open, meet his gaze and ask outright, "Why are you doing this?" But when her palm pressed the iron, courage melted like salt in water. She stood frozen, listening to the soft sound of glass touching wood, then the fading rhythm of hooves carrying him back into the dark. The door remained shut. Her heart, caught between relief and disappointment, thudded on. And so the pattern set itself, day after day. By noon, while scrubbing dishes, she caught herself thinking, only a few hours more. By late afternoon, as she stacked wood, her eyes wandered to the road threading out of the valley. At night, she glanced toward the door more often than the Bible on the table. Once, when Lydia slept soundly, Jacob fell into a fit of coughing, his body shaking with fever. Eliza poured out the last of yesterday's milk, thin and weak, his lips barely closed around the spoon. Then she heard the hoofbeats. On the porch, in the moonlight, a new bottle gleamed. To her, it shone like deliverance. She knew, with a weight that turned her knees weak, that without those silent visits, Jacob might not survive the long winter. And still the question gnawed. Who saves without asking anything in return? And what price might he ask when the time came? She thought often of that first night, of his figure half hidden by the brim of his hat, his broad shoulders casting long shadows in the snow. Not a word spoken, only a single nod. Yet it was the silence that unsettled her most. Silence could mean kindness. It could also mean calculation. One morning, hauling water from the well, she noticed hoofprints circling the cabin. Not the straight track of his coming and going, but a loop that curved around the back before joining the road again. She froze, her breath clouding in the air. Had he walked the perimeter? For what? Curiosity? Caution? Or something darker? All day, every creak of the cabin boards made her flinch. By dusk, while the children gathered kindling, Eliza gripped the window frame and stared into the haze. The horizon blurred with snow, but in her mind, the cowboy's form stood sharp, always coming, always leaving, never leaving a word behind. The days blurred into one another, each night echoing the last. Bread, milk, silence. The rhythm lulled her and unsettled her in equal measure, like a song with no end. In her dreams, she sometimes heard a knock, but woke to nothing but frost and moonlight. The repetition began to feel like a trap she both dreaded and longed for. If one night the hoofbeats did not come, If no loaf lay waiting on the step, would she breathe easier, or would her heart collapse under the emptiness? And it was in that very question that she found her truth. Gratitude was no longer the whole of it. Something else had crept in, nameless and dangerous. What she waited for each night was not only food for her children, but proof that someone out there remembered she still existed. The town could murmur all it pleased. His past could carry whatever shadow it must. But inside that drafty cabin, the steady presence of bread and milk had wound itself into the rhythm of her life. And Eliza, no matter how she denied it, knew deep down she had begun to wait for him. Rumor in a small town moves like wind through the cracks. No one needs to open a door for it. It slips in, seeps under the floorboards, and fills every corner. One morning, when Eliza carried a basket of apples to trade for flour, she heard it rising around her, low voices weaving into a current she could not step out of. They said the widow Whitmore no longer kept her place, that she lived now on the charity of a drifter. They whispered that the bread and milk left on her porch were not kindness, but payment. Some even spat it outright. A woman alone must always be paying one way or another. Eliza walked the rows of market stalls with her wicker basket against her arm, her back straighter than usual, but each word cut like a thorn, sinking deeper than she cared to show. Lydia clung to her sleeve, feeling the tension, though she could not name it. Jacob scowled, as if ready to fight the whole town, but said nothing, for he knew a boy's voice was easy to ignore. Eliza understood. In a place like Timber Hollow, it took only a fragment of a story for the townsfolk to write an entire book, and she had just been cast as their latest chapter. Colt still came each dawn. Bread, milk, sometimes a bundle of wood left neat at the door. Yet now, Eliza could not see them only as signs of care. They had become evidence, proof for wagging tongues eager to tie her name to his. More than once she had thought of stopping him, of stepping outside and telling him never to come again. But each time she glimpsed his figure moving through the mist, the strong line of his shoulders against the pale light, something in her held fast. Part longing, part fear. The whispers swelled into open ridicule on the busiest market day. Eliza laid out her hand-sewn kerchiefs for trade, hoping to earn a few coins, when a knot of women clustered together, their giggles sharp as glass. One leaned close and said, loud enough for others to hear, "Looks like the widow isn't in need anymore. Being kept by a cowboy has its advantages." The words landed like a slap. The air itself seemed to freeze. Eliza bit down hard, her hands trembling against the wicker handle, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had learned to live with grief, but she had never grown used to slander. And then Colt walked into the market. He rarely came into town, preferring the edge of things, but this morning his boots struck the gravel with a weight that drew every head. Conversations faltered. Faces turned. There he was, the man with the shadowed past, the stranger whose name clung to dispute and rumor. Eliza's stomach twisted. His presence would only fan the fire. She thought of leaving, but before she could gather her things, his voice cut through the crowd. "Enough!" Just one word, steady and low, yet it silenced the square. His gaze swept the circle, steady as a gun barrel, and fixed on the women who had laughed. "They say I bring her bread and milk out of pity, or worse, that I come asking a price." His jaw tightened. He drew a breath, then spoke plain. "But the truth is, I come out of love." not charity, not barter. I love this woman, and I wanted her to know it. The words struck harder than any bullet. Eliza stood stunned, her breath locked in her chest. In all her sleepless nights of wondering, she had imagined 100 reasons for his visits. Duty, guilt, simple decency. Never once had she dared to think of love. The market broke into a storm of sound. Some scoffed, others snickered, but a few exchanged wide-eyed glances, startled into silence. In a place where judgment was a way of life, such a declaration was like a blade slicing through the air. Eliza lowered her gaze, heat flooding her face, her hands clenched so tight around the basket that her knuckles whitened. Behind her, Jacob and Lydia stared in awe, their young eyes shining with something new, pride perhaps, for the first time seeing a man stand between their mother and the cruelty of the town. For Eliza, something cracked open. Not trust, not yet, but not fear either. His words had planted a seed, fragile and trembling, but alive. Colt did not linger. He tipped his hat, his eyes flashing with something like defiance toward the onlookers, then turned and walked away, leaving only the echo of his voice behind. That afternoon, back at the cabin, Eliza sat by the window, her sewing forgotten in her lap. She stared at the rutted path where he always came. Inside her, the walls she had built of doubt and caution began to show their seams. Yet along with that softening came a sharper fear. Love was not simple, not here, not with a man whose name carried such weight. Could his words withstand the gale of a town set against them? Could she? The prairie wind moaned across the fields, carrying its own kind of whispers, no different than those that haunted the market. Eliza pressed her fingers against the red thread of her unfinished embroidery, holding on to it as though it were a lifeline. That night, sleep evaded her, his words replayed, steady as the beat of her heart. I come out of love. A single confession, and the ground beneath her feet had shifted. One sentence had changed everything. Dawn came slow that morning. Dew clung silver on the cabin roof, glittering faintly in the weak light of winter. Eliza had been awake long before the sun, moving through the cramped rooms with a restlessness she could not shake. The rumors of the past week lingered in her ears as if whispered from the very walls, about the bread, the milk, the man who left them at her door. Even knowing she had done nothing wrong, judgment still cut like a whip, leaving welts no one else could see. Jacob and Lydia felt the weight too. They were too young to grasp every cruel word, but they knew their mother's silences. They saw the stares that followed them through town. More than that, they saw the cowboy, tall, weathered, wordless, who left behind food that filled their bellies when nothing else did. That morning, while Eliza fussed with the fire, Jacob tugged Lydia's hand and pulled her out into the yard. We should thank him, he whispered, determination bright in his boyish eyes. Lydia bit her lip. Mama won't like it. But he helped us. Without that milk, you wouldn't have had anything last night. The girl hesitated, torn by curiosity and gratitude, and by the empty space where a father should have stood. At last, she nodded. Fingers entwined, they crept to the porch, careful not to be seen. The sound came, just as it always did, the steady clop of hooves in frozen earth. Colt appeared, leading his horse into the clearing. He set a cloth bundle on the step. The smell of warm bread drifted out as Jacob caught sight of the bottle beaded with chill. But before Colt could turn away, Jacob stepped forward. His small voice rang clear in the cold air. "Thank you, sir, for bringing food to Mama and to us." Colt froze. He had never lingered, never sought a word in return. Slowly, he turned, his gaze falling on the two children. For an instant, he looked carved from stone. Then something shifted. His mouth softened into a rare, unguarded smile. Quiet, kind, almost unfamiliar on his face. It was no mask, no courtesy, but a true smile that gentled the hard lines of his eyes. From inside the doorway, Eliza's heart jolted. The sight of him standing there, smiling at her children, knotted her throat with something perilous, something dangerously close to longing. This was the man the town whispered about, the man with a shadowed past, and yet he stood before her cabin, with warmth she had not seen in years. She could not bear the thought of her children clinging to illusions, nor of her own heart being caught in that light. But the seed was there, sprouting despite her fear. Colt bent slightly, his voice low and rough, but steady. "Eat well, little ones." Then he turned, ready to leave. But Jacob, bold with a child's innocence, called after him. "Mama says we don't need it, but we're glad you came. Next time, will you sit and eat with us?" Colt stopped dead. The invitation struck him like an arrow through the armor he had worn for so long. His fingers tightened on the reins. In his eyes flickered something raw, something dangerously close to yearning. Eliza nearly panicked. She burst through the door, pulling the children back. "Jacob, Lydia, inside! Now!" Her voice was firm, though it trembled at the edges. The children obeyed reluctantly, casting one last glance at him. Colt said nothing more. He tipped his head once, then swung into the saddle. The horse carried him off, leaving only dust and silence in his wake. Eliza stood on the porch, her hands pressed to her children's shoulders, her pulse racing. Jacob's eyes shone, Lydia's lips curved with a small, secret smile. Their innocence made Eliza's chest ache. They had seen kindness in the cowboy's smile, where she had forced herself to see only risk. That night, with the children asleep, Eliza sat alone by the fire. She replayed the moment, the smile, the hesitation, the way his hand had tightened on the reins, as if holding back something too dangerous to release. Her heart whispered questions she dared not ask aloud. Was he truly bound only by duty, or was he offering more than bread and milk? Outside, the wind slid through the cracks, cold and sharp. Eliza pulled her shawl close, but the emptiness pressing in could not be shut out. And then hoofbeats, distant, muffled, but real. She rose, peering through the curtain. Colt had returned. His horse stood at the edge of the yard, rider unmoving, as if caught in his own battle. He lingered there in the half-light, then turned and rode away without approaching. Eliza's heart hammered as she watched him vanish into the night. The man branded by whispers, bound to a past she did not know, had become the very figure she could not keep from her thoughts. The one she now feared not because of the town's judgment, but because he had begun to matter. That night, the wind hissed through the cracks of the cabin like needles pricking straight into Eliza's chest. The children slept soundly in the corner bed, their breathing even and steady. But Eliza could not close her eyes. Again and again her mind replayed the cowboy's smile, the rare, tender curve of Colt's lips that seemed so at odds with the shadows whispered about him. She thought of the first night he came with bread and milk, of the mornings he left quietly without a word, of the day he stood in the market and declared aloud that it was not pity but love that brought him to her door. All of it knotted together inside her, a tangle she could not unravel. As she tidied the table, her gaze caught on the worn gray-brown coat draped across the chair by the door. Colt's coat. He had left it behind after stopping that afternoon, while the children had chattered, and Eliza's thoughts had stumbled so badly she hardly noticed when he left without it. She hesitated, then stepped closer, her hand brushing the heavy fabric. It carried the scents of dust and hay, with the faintest trace of peppermint tobacco. Her heart skipped, startled by how swiftly something so simple could stir her. And then, as she lifted the coat, her fingers brushed against a small envelope, tucked carelessly in the pocket. The paper was yellowed, the edges curled with age. On its face, written in dark ink, was her name, Eliza Whitmore. Her throat went dry. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. A letter, addressed to her, hidden in the coat of a man she had only recently come to know. Her hand shook as she drew it out, the brittle folds rough against her fingers. The lamp flame wavered on the wall, as if the room itself held its breath. She sat down, staring at the envelope, torn between fear and need. At last, she slid the letter free. The paper was fragile, the handwriting strong, slanted, strangely familiar, though she could not place it. The message was short, but each word carved deep. Eliza, I owe your family a debt. I have waited for the day I could repay it. If fate allows, I will bring more than bread and milk. I will bring you my heart. Eliza sat still, her pulse pounding in her ears. What did this mean? Colt knew her long before these past weeks. What debt bound him to her family? Why had he carried this letter, and why had it found its way into her hands now? Memory stirred like an old wound. Years ago, when Thomas was still alive, a brutal winter had nearly taken their Livon. She remembered a tall young man, silent eyes, a strong frame, helping stack wood in their shed in exchange for meals. The image had blurred over time, dulled by grief and routine, but now it sharpened. Could Colt have been that man? Her teeth pressed against her lip. A part of her longed to hide the letter away, to pretend it had never been written. Yet another part demanded answers. If Colt had known her before, then his presence was no accident. It was fate, or something that had been circling her for years, waiting for its time. She did not sleep. The lamp sputtered low, shadows creeping over the walls as the hours slipped by. She sat clutching the letter as though it weighed more than stone. When dawn came, Colt appeared as he always did, another loaf in hand. But this time Eliza stood waiting at the door. She held out his coat and the letter. His eyes flickered, not with surprise but with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. Her voice trembled, though her words were firm. You knew me before now, didn't you? For a long while Colt said nothing. The morning wind swept through the yard, carrying the scent of damp earth. At last his gaze locked on hers, steady and unflinching. But instead of answering, he spoke something stranger still. There are debts I never meant to repay with money. Then he turned, leaving her standing in the doorway with more questions than she could bear. By midday, the town was already buzzing again. It wasn't only about Eliza and the cowboy anymore. Old stories surfaced, a fire years past, A banknote paid in full without explanation, and the name Colt whispered in the recollections of the oldest folk. The fragments floated like broken glass, catching light but never forming the whole. Eliza felt her fear and curiosity twist together. The letter might be a blessing, or it might be the key to a darker truth. But one thing was certain. Her heart no longer trembled only with gratitude. It beat with something new, a connection that reached deeper than reason, older than memory. That night, sitting beside her sleeping children, Eliza stroked Lydia's hair and whispered to herself the words Colt had once spoken in the market. "I come out of love, not pity." Now, paired with the letter, those words carried another weight. Heavier, more hidden, but undeniable. She knew she could no longer turn away. The truth was waiting, and only Colt held the key. All that day the sky pressed lower, heavy as a sodden quilt smothering the valley. Clouds hunched dark and thick above Timber Creek, promising a storm that would swallow the town whole. Eliza stood at the window, the coarse curtains stirring in the draft that crept through every seam. The wind was no longer the quiet sigh of open plains, but a long, feral howl, warning of what was coming. A blizzard was near, and when it struck, every roof, every road, every living thing would vanish beneath a ruthless sheet of white. Inside the cabin, Jacob and Lydia busied themselves in silence, trying not to trouble their mother further. They had grown used to lack, to suppers thin as water, to the ceaseless rattling of the walls under each gust. But Eliza had never grown used to emptiness. Since the first night Colt appeared with bread and milk, she had fallen into a habit she would not confess. At dusk her heart tilted toward the door, waiting for footsteps. Tonight, with the snow thickening into a curtain of white, she told herself he would not come. No man in his right mind would risk his life in such fury, not merely to bring food to a poor widow. The room stank faintly of damp wood smoke. Eliza fed the fire what few branches remained, but the flames shrank low, brittle as straw. The store of wood was nearly gone, and the thought of what the night would bring pressed hard on her chest. The children whispered to each other that the kind cowboy would come, but Eliza held her tongue. She would not plant hope only to watch it wither. Time slowed. Each minute dragged down in ice. The roof shuddered under the storm's assault, the wooden shingles creaking as though they might tear free. Eliza clutched her children close, her prayers silent, her heart pounding with the force of the wind. The night stretched long, unyielding, until, against all reason, heavy footsteps sounded through the blizzard. Her breath caught. She knew that gait, steady and sure, burned into her mind by weeks of repetition. She pushed open the door, and the wind roared in, flinging snow against her face. Through the haze of white, a tall figure emerged. Colt. Across his shoulders he bore a great bundle of firewood, in his other hand a basket of bread and milk. Snow clung to his hat and coat, glazing him into something half unreal, a ghost carved from storm. He set the wood and food down on the porch. His breath steamed in the frozen air, and for the first time, he did not turn to leave. He looked up, his eyes finding hers through the swirling snow. What she saw there stilled her. The steadfastness, the strange warmth that cut through the storm more fiercely than fire. Her throat tightened. How long had it been since she had felt someone stand before her, as though her life mattered? Since Thomas's death, no one had borne a burden for her. The townsfolk offered pity, sometimes disdain, but never presence. Not like this. Never someone who stood in the teeth of a blizzard, simply to bring warmth. The door swung wider. Jacob darted out, snow striking his face like knives. "Thank you, sir." His voice trembled, but his joy rang clear. Lydia followed, clutching the bundle of wood. Colt laid a rough hand gently on each child's head. A fleeting smile touched his lips, quiet, unforced, warmer than any flame. Eliza stood frozen in the doorway. Part of her longed to step forward, to draw him inside, to let the storm rage outside while within, at last, she was not alone. Another part held back, tangled in the cruel words of the town. They said he was a man tied to disputes, a bringer of trouble. If she let him in, would she be pulling her children into peril along with her? Colt spoke no word. He rested a calloused palm on Jacob's small shoulder, then turned his gaze on Eliza one last time, deep, unwavering. Then he walked away, the storm swallowing him whole until he was nothing but a blur of white. When the door closed, shutting the blizzard out, the air within felt utterly changed. Eliza looked at the firewood stacked by the hearth, the bread and milk resting on the table. In that moment, fear loosened its grip. Whatever storms raged outside, someone had crossed them for her sake. That night, the fire burned brighter than it had in weeks. The children chewed their bread with laughter, their chatter weaving tales of cowboys and heroes. Eliza did not hush them. She sat quiet, her hand resting on the old letter tucked in the drawer, the one bearing her name in Colt's hand. His secrets pressed against her heart like a weight. Beyond the walls, the storm howled without mercy. But inside, for the first time in years, Eliza felt the sharp edge of her solitude soften. A fragile thought flickered to life. She was not entirely alone. And that thought, small as a spark, was enough to warm the whole night through. The knock came before the sun had crested the ridge. The air outside still held the grip of night, heavy and raw, as though the snow from yesterday's storm refused to loosen its hold. Eliza opened the door with the weariness of a woman who had not slept, expecting, half against reason, the tall shadow with bread and milk. Instead, a stranger stood there. He wore a thick coat buttoned to the throat, his collar stiff with frost, and his eyes hard, as if he carried a ledger of sins in his pocket. He named himself a man of the bank. His voice was dry, cracking like rotted wood. There were no greetings, no soft words. He pulled from his coat a fat envelope and set it on the table, then spoke with a tone that was both official and scornful. The cowboy, Colt, the man Eliza had come to think of as her unlikely savior, bore a stain far too great. He was tied, the banker said, to the coalfield dispute that had cost her husband his life. Eliza staggered back, her hand gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles burned white. The words hollowed her out. For weeks, the image of Colt had been a steady flame in her darkness. The man who left food at her door, who braved storm to bring firewood, who had stood unashamed in the market to speak of love. Now that same figure was accused of helping shape the very tragedy that had shattered her family. The banker's tale cut deeper still. Colt, he claimed, had been hired as a horseman, a handler of weapons for the private men who sought to seize the mine. It was their ambush of the wagons, their show of force that had erupted into blood. Without Colt's hand in supplying horses, they would never have pressed so hard. And among the dead in the aftermath was Thomas Whitmore, her husband. The banker left with a single sentence. "Think carefully, Mrs. Whitmore. Do not let him drag you into the same mire that once stole your husband. His figure vanished into the early snow, leaving behind silence as thick as the frost on the window panes. Eliza stood rooted. The cabin seemed smaller, pressing in on her with every breath. She heard the fire pop in the hearth, smelled the smoke curling low, but inside her chest there was only ice. Memories came flooding. Thomas's rough, calloused hands, the cough that deepened with every winter from dust in his lungs, the morning he never returned. Could Colt's shadow have stretched all the way back to that day? Her gaze fell on a ragged scarf folded on the chair, something Lydia had picked up when Colt left it behind. For the first time, Eliza looked at it with anger. Had he come to her door only out of guilt? Was every loaf, every bottle, an offering laid at the altar of her grief? The day passed in a fog. Jacob and Lydia asked why she was so quiet, but she shook her head. They did not need to know, not yet, that the man they thanked might be bound to the loss that had marked them all. That night, she sat alone at the table with the oil lamp burning low. She pulled from its hiding place the letter she had found in Colt's coat, still sealed, her name written plain on the front. Her hand hovered over it. What if the letter confessed the truth? What if it proved he had always known the weight of her husband's death? Fear knotted her stomach, but so did need. 2 days passed with no sign of him. No bread, no milk, only wind and snow at the door. Relief mingled with emptiness. She told herself it was for the best, that she now had reason enough to turn him away forever. Yet when Jacob whispered, "Mama, isn't there any bread today?" her chest constricted with a pain sharper than hunger. On the third morning he came. The sight of him, snow on his shoulders, a basket heavier than usual with flour and dried apples, stirred the cabin into life. He set the goods down, ready to leave as always, but Eliza's voice broke across the yard. "Why?" He froze, turning to her. She stood in the doorway, pale but burning, her hand gripping the frame as if it held her upright. "Why step into my life, only to lead me back to the death of my husband?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he removed his hat, setting it down in the snow. His face was grave, carved by years, but steady. His voice, when it came, was deep and heavy as stone. He admitted it. He had been there. He had ridden with the men who stopped the wagons. He had held the reins, believing it was no more than a show of force. He had not known it would end in blood. When the shooting began, he said, he pulled men from the line of fire, but not enough. Among those lost was Thomas Whitmore. Eliza felt her knees weaken. Tears blurred her sight. He had not fired the shot, but he had been there, part of it. His presence had helped shape the tide that carried her husband away. Rage and grief tore through her. She wanted to scream, to strike him, to banish him from her life. Yet beneath it all, some part of her recognized the courage it took to stand in the open, to speak truth instead of running from it. He did not flinch from her gaze. "I did not come for pity, not to erase what cannot be erased. I came because what I feel for you is real. I know I may never be forgiven, but I could not leave without telling you so." Eliza collapsed into the chair behind her, her body trembling with fury, with sorrow, with confusion. The banker's words, Colt's confession, the memory of her husband's smile, the laughter of her children, everything tangled together until she could scarcely breathe. Outside, the snow fell steady. Inside, the lamp flickered low, casting long shadows against the walls. Eliza clutched the sealed letter to her chest. The choice lay before her, one road leading back into grief, the other toward a future bound to a man marked by her past. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled and burned all at once, that life in Timber Creek would never be the same again. The wind battered the roof of the cabin, moaning like a cry torn from the far mountains. Eliza could not sleep. The words of the banker still clawed at her chest, accusations thrown like stones across still water, rippling through every thought. The man who had carried her children through hunger, the man her heart had begun to stir for, might also be the one tied to Thomas's death. The oil lamp flickered on the scarred wooden table, its yellow light trembling against walls lined with cracks. Jacob and Lydia slept deeply, their breaths blending with the storm outside. Only Eliza sat awake, hands knotted together, her fingers cold as bone. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then closer, until her heart clenched. 3 soft knocks at the door. She hesitated, then opened it. Colt stood there, snow heavy on his coat, breath fogging the air. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them, heavy with something unsaid. Before she could speak, his voice broke the silence, low, rough, carved with strain. I can't let you hear it all from someone else. You deserve the truth tonight. He stepped inside, shutting the storm away. The room shrank around them. Colt laid his hat on the table, his rough hands trembling ever so slightly. Eliza stood rigid, torn between wanting to hear and wanting to cover her ears. His words came slow, each one a stone dragged from deep water. He admitted his part in the coalfield dispute. Yes, he had ridden with the private men who sought to claim the land, blind to the blood it would cost. But when the collapse came, when the mine walls gave way, he had gone in. He had pulled men from the rubble, though not enough. Among those he could not save was Thomas Whitmore. The air left her lungs. In her mind, she saw Thomas one last time, weary smile, rough hands waving goodbye. And now before her stood the man who had both carried guilt and borne witness to his end. A paradox too heavy for her heart to bear. You were there? Her voice cracked like dry wood. Colt nodded, eyes fixed on the lamp's flame. I held his hand, but the beams broke. The earth gave way. He told me to leave him, to save who I could. I never forgot his face in that moment. For the first time, she saw his weathered features break apart. Tears cut down his cheeks, raw and unhidden. He did not try to hide them, as though they were the last confession he had to give. Eliza stepped back, the room spinning. Rage clawed at her. She wanted to cast him out, to name him enemy. Yet in his eyes, she saw something else. Pain as real as her own, a man crushed not by cruelty, but by the weight of having failed. He had not come only out of pity. He had come because some debts cannot be named. Debts of life, of heart. The silence grew, pierced only by the howl of the storm. At last, she whispered, her nails biting into the chair. So all this time, the bread, the milk, the firewood, it was penance? He dipped his head. Then, slowly, shook it. At first, maybe, but then, it became more. I couldn't stay away. I didn't come to erase the past. I came because I needed to be here, with you, with your children." The words hung in the air. Eliza trembled. No man had spoken to her so since Thomas died, not with grand promises, but with raw, unvarnished truth. Her heart wavered. She thought of Jacob's bright smile when Colt laughed, of Lydia clutching the scarf he left behind like a treasure. The children had already opened their hearts. Only she remained, trapped between past and present. She sank into a chair, covering her face as tears burned hot. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered, "but I can't hate you." Colt lowered himself into the chair across from her. He didn't reach for her, didn't press her with more words. He simply sat, steady as stone, like a sentinel she could lean on if she chose. The night stretched long. Snow fell heavy outside. The lamp dimmed to a glow. The fire crackled low. Eliza lifted her head once, catching him watching her, eyes red-rimmed but steady. For the first time he did not seem a stranger. Something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not love ablaze. But a thin seam of light through darkness. A chance. Her voice came soft but clear. "Tomorrow, I'll hear more. But tonight, stay. Don't leave me alone with ghosts." Colt's throat worked. He nodded, dragging his chair to the door like a guard on watch. Eliza slipped beneath her blanket, her breath easing for the first time in many nights. Through her half-sleep she heard the wind, the crackle of embers, and the sound of boots pacing slow, keeping vigil. By morning, pale light spilled through the cracks. Colt sat slumped in the chair, head tilted against the wall, exhausted. Even in sleep, his hand rested near his hip, as though ready to rise at the faintest threat. Eliza watched him, her chest heavy yet strangely eased. The past still pressed in, the truth not yet settled. But last night he had shown her his truest self, broken, burdened, yet steadfast. She knew the road ahead would not be smooth, but she also knew this. She no longer walked it alone. Eliza still carried the weight of the night before, the way Colt had finally spoken of the past, and how his eyes, hardened by years of dust and sorrow, had brimmed with tears. Doubt had not vanished, but it no longer hung thick as storm clouds. In its place lingered an unsteady space, fragile and uncertain, where fear and yearning lived side by side, a widow such as she could not afford to misstep again. The morning was sharp with cold. Frost clung white upon the fence rails, breath of winter stilling every sound. Jacob, her 9-year-old, rummaged through the old chest in the corner of the cabin. Within lay little more than threadbare clothes and a few relics his father had left behind. Eliza started to stop him, but her hand fell. She knew the children, too, longed to grasp some piece of the man they had lost. Jacob pulled out a faded handkerchief. Its edges were frayed, its fabric darkened by smudges of old coal dust. He turned it over in his small hands, his eyes troubled. Then, as the distant drumming of hoofbeats reached the cabin, sounds as familiar as dawn itself, Jacob bolted for the porch, clutching the cloth tight. Colt appeared, as he always did. Tall, silent, his nod curt. He set down the bread and milk upon the step, ready to turn away. But this time a child's voice rang clear into the cold. "Sir, wait." Colt froze. He turned, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Jacob stepped forward, his small hand trembling as he held out the ragged handkerchief. The wind tugged at it, snapping its edge. "This was my father's," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "He told me once, 'You were a good man.'" Eliza went still as stone. The wind groaned through the shingles, Lydia's breath caught behind her, and her own heart thudded painfully in her chest. Never had Thomas spoken of Colt. Not to her. Why now? Through the lips of her son. Colt's gaze fixed upon the boy. For a moment, something stirred in those sea-dark eyes, something between sorrow and hope. He reached out slowly, taking the cloth, his fingers brushing the child's hand with a gentleness that seemed more vow than gesture. Eliza wanted to cry out, to snatch the relic back, but her body would not obey. Her heart thundered, torn between terror and the tremor of something softer. Jacob's words echoed again. "Father said you were a good man." Colt folded the handkerchief carefully, as though cradling memory itself. Then he raised his head toward Eliza. No smile, no plea. Only the raw steadiness of a man who had laid bare his truth. "I was with your husband in the mine," he said, voice deep and resonant as if carried from stone. "He was brave. I never forgot him, nor the last words he gave me." Eliza's throat closed, her body rigid. Jacob turned to her, his eyes wide as if seeking her confirmation. Lydia clung to Eliza's skirt, her own eyes shining with a child's fragile faith. They had seen too much loss. What they sought now was a reason to believe that the world still held goodness. Something inside Eliza cracked. For so long she had told herself Colt's offerings were born of pity or deceit. But watching Jacob's trembling hand reach out, and seeing Colt's solemn bow, she felt those suspicions scatter like brittle wood under frost. She remembered Thomas's voice once, years ago, as he watched their son stumble through his first steps. "Jacob will grow into a good man." That echo rose again now, like a whisper from the grave, pressing against her heart. Eliza did not move forward, nor did she retreat. She stood in the doorway, trembling between fear and hope. Colt, handkerchief in hand, bowed low to Jacob. It was no empty courtesy. Cowboys did not bow. It was respect, a pledge, a silent covenant. And perhaps it was also meant for her. Then he turned and walked away, fading into the mist of morning. Jacob dashed back, throwing his arms around his mother, his face alight with the certainty that he had done something right. Lydia pressed close, whispering her belief in her brother's words. That night, Eliza lay restless while the wind howled and snow pattered on the roof. She studied her children's sleeping faces, fear and warmth colliding in her chest. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps only illusion. But perhaps it was fate's sign that she was no longer wholly alone. She saw again Colt's eyes as he held the handkerchief, the rare bow he had given. A man burdened by rumors, accused of sins, shadowed by the past. Could such a man still be good? She dared not answer. But for the first time, she no longer tried to push the question away. It had been a child's hand, not her own, that offered the truth she could not yet speak. Trust does not always need proof. Sometimes it is as small as a faded cloth, as simple as a single honest word, yet strong enough to shift the walls of a guarded heart. When the moon's last light spilled through the window, Eliza whispered, half to herself, half to Thomas, and half to the wandering cowboy who lingered in her thoughts. "If you truly are a good man, then show us." That morning, the town was still drowned in a silver fog, thick as a veil that blurred everything from sight. Eliza opened the door, already used to the shadow of a cowboy lingering on her porch. But this time something was different. Not just the neatly placed sack of bread and jug of milk, not just the stack of dry wood laid carefully to the side. It was Colt himself standing there, his eyes fixed straight on her, the pale light of dawn brushing across his sun-worn, yet resolute face. He didn't turn away in silence as he had done every day before, didn't vanish quickly into the mist. Colt slowly lifted his calloused hand, placed it over his chest. His voice was low, steady, plain, stripped of any flourish. "I bring my whole heart, if you'll take it." Eliza stood frozen, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress. Her heart felt caught in an invisible grip, trembling, fearful, yet burning warm. Day after day she had grown accustomed to his quiet presence. The bread, the milk, the chopped wood. Offerings that stirred both gratitude and caution. For his past was tangled with the indirect death of her husband, and the town's whispers had never ceased behind her back. But now Colt was no longer hiding in silence. He laid it bare before her, not silver, not promises, but his heart. Eliza heard her own whisper escape, frail as wind through a crack in the door. Why would you choose me? A penniless widow scorned by the town, burdened with sorrow's shadow? Colt looked at her, his eyes free of pity, free of doubt. Because it's those very things that make you strong. You rose from loss, raised your children while the whole town turned its back. You are no burden. You are proof of courage. Eliza turned away, unsettled. Inside the house, Jacob and Lydia still slept, their breathing soft and steady. She heard the pop of wood in the stove, smelled the warm drift of smoke. Part of her longed to believe, to lay down the weight of doubt and take in this warmth. But another part shrank back, timid as a bird once broken in flight. Colt seemed to understand the pull within her. He didn't step closer, didn't press for an answer. He only stood there, his hand still on his chest, letting her see that his words were true. I don't expect you to decide today. I only want you to know that from now on, whenever I bring bread and milk, my heart comes with them. And it'll be there, waiting until you're ready. The words settled in her like a small flame. Not a blaze, but enough to thaw the ice that had long locked her heart. That day, Eliza could not work as she usually did. Her hands trembled kneading dough, rinsing vegetables, hanging clothes on the line. Each gesture of Colt replayed itself, his hand over his chest, his eyes lit in the mist. She remembered the long nights, listening to the wind howl against the roof, thinking she was alone in the world. Then the sound of cowboy boots on the porch, the soft thud of a sack of bread on the step, had become her anchor for another day. Now all those silent deeds carried a name: love. Eliza sank onto a chair, pressing her face into her hands. Tears came. She couldn't tell if from gratitude or fear. For once a heart is opened, she knew, there is no turning back. By evening, Jacob and Lydia returned from helping a neighbor split wood. They found their mother sitting quietly by the stove and whispered between themselves. Eliza only smiled faintly, but even that ghost of a smile made Lydia tilt her head in thought. The children seemed to sense something had shifted. That night, As they ate their simple meal, Lydia suddenly spoke softly. "Mother, if Mr. Colt is truly good, I think you shouldn't be afraid." Eliza startled, looking at her daughter. Lydia had grown, her eyes bright and older than her years. Jacob nodded, still chewing his potato. "I saw him smile at us. I believe him." The innocence in their voices struck deeper than any sermon. Their trust chipped away at the walls Eliza had built around her heart. In the days that followed, she found herself waiting. Each morning when she opened the door, she didn't only see bread and milk. She sought his eyes in the fog. And when they met, she turned quickly away, but her heart betrayed her with its quickening. Colt kept to his word. He never pressed, never pried, only repeated the ritual. Yet now, every footprint he left in the snow, every breath that lingered in the mist, carried weight, because behind them lay the confession he had spoken. One morning, Eliza did something different. She left a small handkerchief beside the bread, hastily sewn but clean. When Colt found it, he only nodded, tucking it into his coat pocket without a word. But Eliza knew. That small act was her faltering answer, a sign that she was beginning to open. The town's gossip never ceased. Tongues wagged, some mocking, some pitying. But this time Eliza felt different. For when she recalled Colt with his hand over his chest, speaking words plain as dirt yet true as stone, she felt a new strength. The strength to lift her head and walk past the whispers. One night, as the wind whistled through the shutters, Eliza sat by the stove watching her children sleep. She realized her heart was no longer sealed tight. The grief of her husband's death was still there, but it no longer crushed her breath. In its place, a new light had crept in, small as a fire's glow against the cold. She thought of Colt's words. "My heart will be here, waiting until you're ready." And for the first time, Eliza whispered to herself, "Maybe that day is near." Eliza did not answer right away. The words spoken out on the porch still lingered in the air, slipping through the cracks of the door and brushing against her heart like the first breeze of spring. Fragile, yet warm. She only quietly took the loaf of bread, set it on the wooden table, and cut it into small slices for the children. Jacob and Lydia glanced at each other, their eyes shimmering with expectancy. In that plain little room, the smell of fresh bread mingled with the scent of burning wood, spreading like a reminder that life, no matter how harsh, could be softened by the simplest of things. A faint smile crossed Eliza's lips. Not a full smile, but enough to chase away the heavy fog that had shrouded her spirit through all the dark months. She said nothing to the cowboy outside, only a brief lowering of her head, like a silent acknowledgement, as though the door of her heart, long shut, had cracked open just a little. Colt stood motionless on the porch. He was used to Eliza's silence, but this time, the stillness was different. It was like a fiddle waiting for the touch of a bow to let a new song rise. On his weather-worn face, toughened by sun and wind, a quiet smile flickered, gentle, as if he knew no more words were needed. Outside, snow still blanketed the prairie, but the sky was beginning to clear. A band of pink stretched across the ridge, heralding the new day. Light fell upon the old porch roof, upon the cowboy's dust-stained boots, upon Eliza's faded dress, and upon the innocent eyes of Jacob and Lydia. In that moment, everything seemed wiped clean. The rumors, the wounds, the fear, and the doubt. Only one truth remained, plain and unshaken. They were still alive, and they could still choose love. Eliza sat down, her hands trembling as she cut the final slice of bread. The memory of her husband rushed back, as it always did when she divided food for the children. But today, that memory did not pierce only with pain. It carried a strange peace, as if the departed were smiling too, watching his family find a fragile piece of hope. Colt did not step inside. He only turned, picked up the cowboy hat resting on the step, set it on his head, and walked away in silence. Yet Eliza knew his steps were slower than usual, as though waiting for a voice to call him back. She did not call, not because she wished him gone, but because she understood. Everything needed its time, and time itself was the greatest gift fate was offering them. Jacob suddenly darted out to the porch, carrying a slice of bread. He held it out to the cowboy. A small gesture, yet filled with childlike faith, as if he were speaking for his mother, telling this man that even in this worn little home, there was room for him. Colt accepted it, his rough hands quivering slightly, then pressed the bread to his chest. No oath was spoken, only a silence that felt sacred. Eliza saw it from inside. She did not stop her son, did not call him back. Her heart, after so many storms, was still at last. True, she was not ready to speak, but neither did she wish to shut the door again. A thin smile touched her lips, fragile but honest. The day passed like any other, yet within each of them something had shifted. Lydia helped her mother stack the wood. Jacob busied himself sketching the figure of a cowboy in the dirt. Eliza sat by the window, needle and thread trembling less in her hands. Outside, Colt led his horse down the slope. No haste, no hiding. Each print his boots left in the snow seemed to declare that some roads were meant to be, waiting only for the courage to walk them. When night came, the lamp in the cabin burned later than usual. Eliza sat still, listening to the wind whistle across the porch. But unlike the lonely nights before, her heart no longer feared abandonment. In its place was a quiet trust that someone out there was awake too, keeping watch over this fragile piece. The story does not close with a kiss, nor with a vow of forever. It ends here, in the in-between, where each heart, reader or listener, may kindle its own flame. For love in the Wild West is not always fierce and sudden. More often it is quiet, patient, like a hidden stream running through stone, like a seed pushing upward through the grip of winter. Eliza laid her hand on her chest, her heart pounding not from fear, but from anticipation. Her faint smile, her children's watchful eyes, the cowboy's slow steps, all wove together into an open ending, leaving behind a long echo. For perhaps true love needs no grand declarations. It is enough in simple presence, in a loaf of bread divided 3 ways, in a door left slightly ajar. And in that desert of storms and dust, this was the greatest hope a soul could keep. Have you ever lived through a chance encounter that changed your life forever? Share your story in the comments below. It may become a light for someone else. And if this tale has touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share so that more may hear these human Wild West love stories. Thank you for journeying with us. And until next time, may love and trust keep burning, even through the fiercest winter night.